So we're now streaming live, so feel free to start the meeting. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. Okay, good morning, everybody. Obviously, I'd like to start the meeting, and as always, I'd like to begin by welcoming those members of the public and the press who are watching the live stream of this meeting via the Council's website. Minutes of the meeting will be produced in the usual way, and a recording of the meeting will be available to view on the Council's website. Now, to enable the meeting to run in an orderly manner, I would ask all members of the forum who have the video cameras to keep their video cameras switched on for the duration of the meeting and to keep their microphone muted, except when I invite you to speak. Officers will join us to introduce their reports in the same way. Any members wishing to ask questions or make a comment should indicate this by using the raised hand function, which you can access obviously on the screen. We've done this a few times now, so hopefully you know what you're doing. Obviously, this will show attendees on the right-hand side of the screen, and I will invite you to speak, and then please unmute your microphone, ask your question, and then mute it again to allow the relevant officer to respond. We'll ask for your patience if we run into technical problems, and should this occur, I will declare an adjournment while the fault is addressed and the public broadcast will be paused. If it is not possible to address the fault, the meeting may well be abandoned until such a time as it can be reconvened. So, members, what we're going to do is begin the meeting with a roll call to establish who is present. When Tamar calls out your name, please confirm your attendance by unmuting your microphone and stating you are present, and the sector, please, that you're representing, again, for the benefit of those people who are joining us on the public live stream. I'm now going to pass over to Tamar, our Democratic Services Officer, to do the roll call. Tamar.
So, Simon Bainbridge.
Morning, yes, present. I'm here representing Academy Special Schools.
Adrian Ball. No Adrian. Christopher Bennett.
Present, representing secondary academies.
Nikki Brown.
Hiya, representing primary maintained schools.
John Culpin.
Representing academies.
Joe Gilman. Joe not there. Joe Gilman, no. Joanne Hardwick.
Good morning, I'm representing Maintained Special Schools.
And Ryan Kelsall. No Ryan Kelsall. John King.
Yeah, present, representing the academies.
Duncan Ramsey.
Present as well, recommending primary and secondary academies.
Richard Spencer.
Morning, present, representing secondary academies.
Paul Strafford.
Yeah, present, representing maintained governors.
Karen Taylor.
Present, representing the academy sector.
And Guy Underwood. No Guy Underwood?
I believe Guy's got a visit today, so that may be why he's not here.
Jeremy Lloyd. No Jeremy Lloyd. Deborah Parfitt. No. We got Councillor Claire Daunton. No.
Yes, I'm here.
Sorry,
Claire Daunton, I'm here. Yes.
Okay. Councillor Bryony Goodliff.
Good morning.
Councillor Simone Taylor. No. And I've Rob Turner. Okay, that should be everybody. Is there anybody that I haven't mentioned? No? Okay. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Tamar. Obviously, our thoughts are with those colleagues at the moment who are having Ofsted inspections. One of our schools is also having an inspection this week. Yeah, quite brutal at this particular point in the term. Okay, so we'll move to the first item on the agenda, which is apologies for absence. Tamar, apologies, please, from anybody?
I received apologies from Mark Vickers, and Joel Gilman was attending as substitute, but I don't think she's here. Nadine Gooding Herbert, Alex Pearson, Andrew Reid, Claire Clark, Suzanne Cannell and John Devine. And then there was the others that have just been mentioned previously.
Thank you. And I believe Ryan Kelso has just joined us as well.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? And in particular, can I draw members' attention to the growth policy item? I would like to declare an interest as one of the schools that Anglian Learning is responsible for is listed in that particular item. Although having discussed that with Tamar, we don't believe this actually precludes anybody from that item or from voting. But anybody else here who would like to declare an interest because one of your schools actually is cited in part of that paper, please do so now. Richard?
Yes, one of the Meridian Trust schools is cited in the same way, John.
Thank you very much, Richard. Okay, I can't see any other hands up, so thank you very much. In which case then we'll move to the next item on the agenda, which is to actually look at the minutes of the 4th of November. And what I'll do is just go through these as always page by page using the numbering that actually existed in the agenda pack. So starting with page 3. If you want to raise your hand, if you wish to raise a point of accuracy only, please do so. So page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, and finally page 9. The only comment I have is just a reminder, which is at the top of page, bottom of page 7, top of page 8, which is that John and I were going to discuss how to use Forum as a campaigning group and so on. Obviously, that was slightly superseded by the announcement in the autumn statement, but I think, John, that's something we'll still come back to at the start of the spring term. Otherwise, unless anybody's got any comments on those minutes, hopefully we can agree those as a correct record of that meeting. Okay, thank you very much. In which case then, moving swiftly on to item 3 on the agenda, which is the school's budget setting 23-24, which is going to be presented to us by John and by Martin. They're going to take us through the presentation, setting out the different proposals and decisions required for them. And at various points in that presentation, they're going to pause, enable questions to be asked at the relevant sections. So at this particular point, I think we're first of all going to look at DSG funding arrangements, autumn statement, and the consultation feedback, in which case I'm probably going to hand first of all to John.
Yep, thank you, Chair. Martin, I think you're going to pull the slides up. That's helpful, thank you. Obviously, you'll be aware from the last forum, we brought you sort of details, headlines of where we were with the budget settlement and the updates. We don't yet have the final position for our budgets. We're going to go into that as we move through the slides. We're expecting that in the next week or so. Very hopefully that does come sooner rather than later to give us a chance to work it through. But what we've tried to do now is close off the other remaining issues, some of the follow-up from the last meeting, and obviously some reflection on the announcement going forward. So we'll step through these slides. Obviously, some of this has been shared previously. We did budget briefings, and we had actually really good attendance on those budget briefings. Obviously, we will now step through what that means and the next step. So thank you, Martin. Next slide. So the autumn statement, you've obviously had a chance to absorb this. These were the headlines that came through at the time. Obviously, as John's already said, we stepped into the last forum with disaster written all over it. I think my reading of it is that it's taken the edges off the pressure as opposed to necessarily resolved the ongoing challenges that we face as a sector in terms of the funding. Headlines were an additional 2.3 billion, which was quickly reduced to 2 billion once they'd adjusted for the money that came out to schools in this financial year for the health and social care levy, but still a sizable investment going forward. And very much the government's headline rhetoric has been around, we're back to 2010 per pupil levels of funding, which I'm going to come on and reflect on later in the slides. But as I said, a positive step forward. At the time, we were trying to predict what it may mean. And I think I've left this slide in, even though it's not the latest position, because it does show the growth by year. It does show how the government went from its original budget, what the original uplifts were going to be, and what it means now in terms of additional funding. The phasing is slightly different, as you see on the next slide. I will still put in the caveat. I think pay is our biggest challenge in the sector. You can see there the cost of the pay increase across education is significant for this year. I suspect that's very much an estimate figure, and obviously it differentially impacts upon schools depending on your staff profiles, particularly around lower paid staff. There is a significant challenge around the growth in the local government pay settlement, but nonetheless, still a sizable increase in the funding. And at this point, we didn't quite know where the additional money was going, and we still don't know completely, but we have got some hints and things that have come through from our conversations with the DfE. So on the next slide, this is something that I picked up at a fair funding conference that I was lucky enough to chair and grill the DfE directly on it. But you can see there the impact of the funding coming in 23-24 has been weighted slightly different than we expected. Obviously, headlines were 2 billion plus 2 billion. There's actually slightly more coming through. It's quite interesting. The figures are slightly different that they've got coming through. And the money is going into what's called the core school budget. So we have lots of interchangeable terms around the DSG, the schools budget. It used to be ISB. There's all sorts of different headings that they've used previously. But we do now know how that money is being distributed. We don't know how much we're getting, but we do know how it's being distributed. So the core schools budget will include schools, the high needs block, the central schools services block, and pupil premium. So great news in those areas. Money will be passported through. Again, we don't know how it's coming through. We know what we do know is that high needs is getting around £400 million of that uplift across the 2 years. Which is an inflation uplift when you look at how much is going to work its way through. The headlines we're getting on schools budgets is somewhere in the region of 5% additional funding that will equate to 5% at the school level. And pupil premium, we assume that will be a similar uplift coming through. I think it's really important to point out what's not getting uplifted as well. Sorry, Martin, just to get back to that previous slide. What's not getting lifted up is early years. Post-16 funding is absent from this. So we are seeing impacts in other sectors that are directly linked to education, where that funding isn't coming through. And, I think both of those are hugely concerning to us, particularly as minimum wage support in the early years sector is a challenge. Post-16 has not been well funded for a decade, and the squeeze there, lower numbers, we could see some real challenges around delivery and coverage. Interestingly, there's no pupil growth coming through, so that cash figure goes further. Actually, there's a slight decline. Inflation is, again, another interesting prediction. So what we've been told is that for 23-24, they're expecting inflation to run at about 7.4%. And for 24-25, about 1.5%. So obviously headlines today, inflation still running at 10.5, I think it was, that's come out today. There is still that recognition going down. And I think particularly for staff pay awards, we've got a 3% pay award for teachers predicted in the 23-24 academic year. This is going to be a challenge for us because I can't imagine that's necessarily going to stay at 3%. So again, a positive settlement going forward, but not probably resolving some of those issues. The other factor we've been told is that there's no continuation of the energy bill relief scheme. So this is the cap that exists, and some schools have benefited from that, some haven't. Obviously, there was an announcement last week coming through about additional capital funding to try and mitigate some of that risk. I'm not sure the levels of investment are going to be sufficient to negate energy increases. They will obviously be, and it's a helpful contribution towards, but schools will need to budget potentially where they are in their energy cycle contracts for an increase in those costs. So, positive, but lots of things we don't know yet that we need to work through. Move on. Next slide, Martin. Thank you. I did mention the challenges around the government's drive on where we are. So this chart from the Institute of Fiscal Studies helpfully shows where we will be. This makes us this applies the government assumptions around inflation and that being met going forward. And the fact that it will bring us back towards where we were in 2010. I think the point I've been trying to make on this, and I did raise this with the DFE, is that education expectations, needs in schools are very different to 2010. You know, I'll give the example of the type of need we were supporting in a special school in 2010, very different now, 12 years later. And, you know, great news around spending, but I think the challenges that we face in the sector, the catch up from COVID, other pressures, will obviously, you know, erode any benefit that's derived from going back to 2010. So I just thought it was important to probably share that, so you're aware of that's where the government's expectations are. And I think I've captured most of this in the slide going forward in terms of where we are. And obviously the IFS is also making the statement around pay awards being the variable factor that we are going to have to deal with, and you know, whether there'll be further adjustments depending on what any pay recommendation updates may be, we don't know. But obviously we've got a 2-year settlement. That's positive. At least we have some certainty around our funding. But I think for Cambridgeshire schools, this is going to still mean difficult decisions, cuts, and different ways of operating. So again, I think we've captured most of these in this slide going forward. The one area I will pull out, and the one I'm more worried about, is the impact of recession. We know free school meal vouchers, free school meal requirements are coming out. We've literally run the vouchers this week for the holidays, and we can see growth is continuing in those children and those needs. Because those children now qualify for free school meals, more money is needed to support their catch up in terms of attainment, pupil premium, other things. So our pot of £4 million is getting eroded all the time, and schools are dealing with more challenges that arise from that particular scenario. I know it's not a linear, you know, a child goes on free school meal, there's more needs, but there is obviously a demand and pressure building in the system that we need to work our way through. So just useful, I think, to signpost that going forward. Okay, thanks, Martin. So Martin will cover some of the detail. I thought it would be useful I just close off the consultation. So as I said, we ran some positive consultation events. We asked schools, we didn't ask questions as such, we asked them for people for feedback on the proposals, because we weren't making huge changes. Obviously, the big area that you agreed at the last meeting was the school block transfer between schools block to high needs block. And you know, we went through in those sessions that rationale, and we're proposing no other change to our formula aside from that. Martin, moving on to the next slide, we had, you know, good turnout at those events, and one whole response to our consultation. So thank you to that school that did respond. I think there's been a lot of dialogue and debate. I think we've tried really hard to get out there and explain it. I think people understand the pressure and the situation we're in, and the collective approach that we've taken to date for it. But, you know, I've been at pains to discuss at CYP committee and other forums, none of this is easy. This is not a good budget for any of us. And, you know, what we have done is worked collaboratively on it. You know, obviously that one response that we did highlight all the pressures that I've mentioned previously: pay awards, energy cost, and the challenges of meeting SEND needs. So, you know, we understand why we haven't had responses. Obviously, your role now is to make the final decisions about the proposals that we are making around setting the schools' budgets. So we'll stop there. John, happy to take any questions or comments on anything I've covered before I hand over to Martin for the detail.
Thank you very much, John. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask at this particular point? I mean, I suppose I've got one, just perhaps while people would reflect. I mean, I don't know whether you had the opportunity when you were talking to DFE officials when you were chairing the Fair Funding Forum, any rationale for why they're not investing in early years or post-16, if indeed pro-education means being pro-growth, and considering the pressures coming through post-pandemic of the support required for early years? Is it just simply a financial decision, or was there some sort of rationale behind only funding the schools element?
I think there were ministerial prioritisation of the resources. Obviously, education and health were the only two areas in the whole of government that actually received further funding. I think they had to draw a line, and I think they felt that the early years, it's a sector-led model as opposed to being run in the state system. I'm not sure that's a good rational argument for why you wouldn't put money in it. And post 16, we didn't get an answer on that, so I can't comment on it. I think what that may mean is that there's going to be more subsidisation of both schemes where there are schools involved. And as a local authority, we're concerned early years sufficiency, our duty there. We want all children in early years settings. And if we don't have a market, because it is a market-led sector, that will be a pressure. So no, not a good answer, John. I think it was a prioritisation challenge for the government. I think that's what they've allocated.
Thank you, John. Richard?
Thanks, John. Any indication following on from that around the additional capital funding? Will that be released to sixth form colleges and maintained nurseries as well?
I'm going to look to Martin. I know sixth form colleges have got additional funding. I think the calculations do take account of sixth form pupils for the overall calculation, and I'm pretty sure maintained nurseries has got something, Martin. But can you confirm if you've got the figures in front of you?
Yeah, I was just looking, John. I can't see anything. If you leave it with me, I'll have a quick look. I think it's on the same basis as devolved formula capital. So if maintained nurseries receive devolved formula capital, they'll also receive the additional allocation on that basis. But I'll have a quick look and see if I can.
Do we expect that, Martin? Do you know whether that additional capital is likely to be released this year or
yes, it will be definitely. The DfE have said it will be released in December. So we, as a local authority, expecting to get it for maintained schools later this month, then passport it onto maintained schools in January. I'm not quite sure. I'm assuming they'll release it directly to multi-academy trusts or individual academies on the same timescales.
And sorry, one other question, just from the academy sector point of view. Have you had any indication of what mechanism might be used to release the funding increases to academies for the duration of this academic year? Obviously, our budgets run August to August.
Yeah. So my understanding is they are going to reflect the April change. So there will be a certain waiting for that, but we don't know at the moment. This is what we're waiting to see, the cascade of the funding. We don't know whether it's going in the funding formula, whether it will be like the supplementary grant was last year. We don't know, but I think there is a recognition that you can't, as we normally have this sort of maintain, get it first and then academies get it after. I think there is a recognition that both sectors need it at the same time, and simply wait until September is not there. But Martin, I don't know if you've seen anything firmer than that, but I think
I mean,
know how it's being allocated. I don't think we can say, but they will have to be clear on it, because if we put it in the formula, it obviously won't reach you till September.
Yeah, my expectation, based on the brief discussions I've had with colleagues from the local authorities, we're expecting it to be a continuation probably of the supplementary grant, and we think that'll probably be easier to administer from a DfE perspective as well, because it will clearly show those amounts. And as John said, if the intention is to passport money onto academies, doing it as a separate grant for that April to August period would be a much cleaner way of doing it. But until we see that final settlement, we're a little bit in the dark. Just to confirm, I have just looked, and maintained nurseries schools do also get that additional funding, capital funding as well. So, and sixth form colleges. So as I said, it's all of those that receive devolved formula capital are eligible for that additional capital funding as well. And based on the criteria that they've given, although it has kind of been linked to energy schemes in that range, it is down to the discretion of schools as to which capital projects they spend it on. So I don't think it has to directly be linked on that, but obviously they need to consider what their priorities are around that capital spend.
Thanks ever so much.
Thank you, Martin. Just on that last point, John, and I know it's not necessarily quite the remit of schools forum, but is there additional guidance and support the local authority will provide maintained primary schools in terms of using that capital money effectively, given that that leeway and how that money is being spent? But actually, as we're not getting any further support with the energy relief scheme, then it's increasingly important that actually all schools use that to be targeting their energy savings as well as possible. What additional support or guidance can you offer schools in that regard?
So we've talked to our energy management team. Obviously, we've been offering support out to all schools. It's not just Maintain schools. I will follow up with them and see whether we can provide further advice. I think maybe frameworks might be an appropriate thing to support you with about where you can go for that energy advice and support. Just a reminder, though, that we are offering out loans through various sources, some councils, some through other sources, and that's available to all schools in the county as well. So, you know, maybe, John, I'll get something out in the new year, signposting people to where they need to go. There is some DFE advice and guidance out there. I think there's a webinar coming up as well. So we'll try and collate all that point of contact and information for schools, because I do think, you know, this is one off here. My cynic in me says they've got some cash left over and they're pushing it out that way, but let's make the maximum out of it and look at where you need to go. And I think, you know, I've seen a lot of organisations trying to capitalise on this money coming through as well, and I've been contacted to speak to lots of people about schemes, and I think we need to manage that very carefully.
Thank you. Yes, that was my observation as well, that there are a lot of people out there trying to sell us kind of the snake oil involved in this, and people have to choose wisely in terms of what they're spending their money on. Okay, thank you. I'm just quickly having a look around and see if anybody has any further questions. I can't see any other hands up, in which case then, obviously, as I said earlier on, you're asked to note that, and we move on then to the next stage in the presentation, which I think probably over to you, Martin, then, is it?
Yeah, it will be. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so as we discussed at the previous meeting around the notional SAM budget, so this is just kind of pulling together parts of the Q2 conversations we had. So as you'll remember, we discussed that every local authority needs to have a notional SAM budget within its formula. It's not a separate allocation of funding, but it is a kind of a generational model in terms of the how much of the formula funding is directed towards the notional SEN. As we said, currently the percentage that we apply in the Cambridgeshire formula are considerably lower than both our statistical and regional neighbours. And one of our concerns was that as we move towards a direct national funding formula, the DFE have proposed that they're potentially going to move towards a national approach of the notional SEN. And if they were to do that, it would be a bit of a cliff edge for us if they move to the kind of the more the national position. Therefore, what we've proposed is a kind of a stepped increase in terms of the percentages applied based on the numbers that we currently do up to an increased allocation. So as you can see in this table here, the column on the left hand side shows the current percentages to which we apply to the notional SEN.
Martin, sorry to interrupt, unless this is just me, I can't see the slides. I think I can see you, but I'm not sure you're presenting
right, apologies.
Slides.
Oh, it says I am sharing, so apologies. I'll come out and go back in again.
Thank you, Martin.
Is that back again? Yep, apologies. Yes, so the column on the left-hand side shows the current percentages we apply to the notional SEN within the local formula, which equate to just over 7% of the total schools block. And the column on the right-hand side shows the proposed percentages we're putting forward to apply for the 23-24 budgets, which equate to just over 9%. As you can see below, the statistical neighbours is just under 11% at the moment, and the Eastern region, excluding ourselves, is just under 10%. We also circulated the Appendix 2, which just shows the illustrative level of what that would mean at individual school levels, still using the 22-23 budgets, but just to show what amounts that would equate to for individual schools moving into 23-24. As we said, it doesn't affect the funding that schools would receive through the funding formula, but moving on to the next section, it potentially would impact on the methodology we use for allocating the high nodes contingency. So I'll do the next bit and then take it all together in terms of comments and observations on the two elements, if that's okay. Okay, fine. Can you still see that? Is it still there? Yeah. So as we said at the last meeting, we discussed the methodology for the high needs contingency, and it was requested that we looked at a hybrid methodology, which looked at both the percentage of EHCPs on roll for individual schools, and then looking at where the cost of that £6,000 exceeded the current notional SEM for 22-23. So again, shared the appendices, Appendix 3, which showed the proposed school level allocations for the current financial year based on this revised hybrid methodology. What we've actually done is we've taken, now we have got the October census data, we've actually taken that October census data as the kind of the point in time, point in the year to use that, because within that we could see both the current role in individual schools, and also within there it lists the number of pupils who currently have education, health and care plans within individual schools as well. So we felt that gave us a kind of a cut-off point in time. We do recognise that what that does mean, it doesn't pick up potentially any in-year movements which have taken place to date or could potentially take place in the future, but obviously it would be quite an intensive industry to continually change the allocations based on that. What we also recognise is that the funding methodology, this hybrid methodology, does have some winners and losers from the previous approach that we proposed, which either looked at one or the other. So it does kind of pick up both of those elements, but as I say, it hopefully it kind of does what was intended in terms of targeting that resource to where it's most needed for those schools with the high proportion of EHCPs within their school role at the moment. So I'll pause there and obviously take any comments, questions on both the proposed increases in terms of the notional SEM for 23-24, and also the methodology we're proposing for the allocation of the funding in the current financial year, which the intention would be to get that out to schools in January as a one-off payment.
Thank you very much, Martin. Just looking to see if anybody has any comments. Again, these are to comment on these proposals, no vote required, but obviously any feedback I'm sure will be appreciated by officers. Adrian, first of all.
Perfect. Thanks, Martin. I've just got one question on the percentage increases in the notional funding formula. It was just questions how you came up to that allocation, just in terms of the split between the different factors.
Yeah, so effectively the original percentages were based on our funding formula when we moved across the national funding formula on the left-hand side, so the basic entitlement, free school meals. So effectively all I've done is scaled those up in line with our statistical and regional neighbours to try and come closer to what they're actually doing in terms of their average approach. So it's effectively scaling it up to just be more in line with the approach which is being taken in those other local authority areas. And then I've just rounded it based on the kind of the closest whole percentage effectively. So it's not an exact science by any stretch, but it kind of does more align us with those neighbours.
Okay, cool, thank you.
I'm just checking to see if anybody has any further comments at this particular point. If I miss you, apologies. Okay, I can't see any further hands up at this particular point, in which case my thanks to Martin and the team for working through the change to the notional SEND and also the allocation resource for the contingency and so on. I'm assuming then if nobody has any further comments, we'll accept that as the way going forward. And we move on to the next section of the presentation, which is retained funding and de-delegations maintained. So sorry, John.
Just to say, if you're happy, we will now write to schools. We'll explain the rationale behind it, why we've arrived at what we've done, give the figures. Obviously, the notional SEND will be recast with the latest budget estimates, but I think it's important we get this out. I think there are some schools that are challenged around the contingency, and I'm quite keen to get that sorted. So I'll look to get that out, but I may delay that until after Christmas, and then we'll get that straight out in the new year.
I think that'd be wise, yes, after Christmas. Sorry, Martin.
Yeah, no, and I was just going to say, and the eagle-eyed amongst you would have probably noticed that actually the amount we're saying we're going to allocate is about 469,000, I think, compared to the £450,000 that we said was available. But I think we'll just accept that in terms of the kind of the tolerance in terms of the need of those individual schools. So we'll allocate the amount as per the spreadsheet. And then what we will need to do as John said, when we recast it for 23-24, we'll probably then have to revisit this methodology a little bit and see how we apply it going forward as well, because obviously as the notional SEN becomes higher, the kind of that differential between the 6,000s also changes. So we'll need to revisit that. But as John said, if we get focus on getting this year's out to those schools that require it, and then we can readdress.
Thank you very much, Martin. I noticed you got your hand up, Nikki. Would you like to raise a point before we move on?
Yeah, I was just going to ask whether there's been any modelling looking at specific sort of school profiles as to whether there are any particular groups which would be more adversely affected. So, for example, often it's the very small primary schools where these sort of proportional changes can have a really big impact. Whether there was any particular group of schools or profile that would be perhaps that this would be more difficult for?
I think because of the nature of how the formula works, it's not as straightforward as that kind of group, and it's going to depend on all of their individual characteristics in terms of so you can have the small schools in affluent areas which are going to be differently impacted than small schools in more deprived areas. So I don't think it's the combination of that rationale and the formula factors. So it's not it's not a set pattern really. I think what's interesting in terms of the SEN itself is actually when you look at the percentages of some of those smaller schools with very high percentages of EHCPs on roll in certain parts of the county as well. And I think that'll be an interesting one. And I think that's why we wanted to kind of put a bit more of a focus on the percentage on roll in terms of allocating some of this contingency to reflect where those schools do have that higher proportionate level. But I think alongside what John was saying about free school meals increasing, all of that, I think once we get the revised data sets in the DFE, it's probably worth doing a bit of a look to see what has changed across that whole pattern, because it will impact on the whole funding allocation.
I think for me, the factor is the amount of children that are from out of the county coming in is a slightly different picture than I expected, and it's hitting different parts of the county in different ways as well. So, obviously the main formula and the way we work doesn't always pick up some of that profile, because we don't have a direct EHCP measure in the formula, but obviously the impact is there, and it's having a differential impact. I'm not sure we can resolve that one, but it is quite interesting how it's changed so much, including those children that are outside of the county.
Thank you, John. I think we said originally, we're trying to do the best here, and it may have to alter and adjust, and we'll get feedback as we go forward. And if the formula's not right, then in some way we might have to tweak it, but at least we're making a start, and I think is the key thing.
Yep.
Okay, I'm just going to check one more time. Is there any further comments? Okay, I can't see any further hands up. Please do shout if I've missed you. Okay, in which case then let's move on to the next part of this, which is retained funding and dedelegation. So over to Martin.
Yeah, thank you. So hopefully this will be reasonably straightforward. This is just a continuation of the previous methodology we've had in place for both retained duties funding. So for each maintained primary school, we retain £10 per pupil, and that amount hasn't changed since we introduced this when the old Education Services grant ended a few years ago. And so the proposal is to continue to retain that £10 per pupil for all the services specifically provided to maintained schools. And then similarly in terms of the delegations, which applies to maintained primary schools only, we currently have the four the delegations which we use, because obviously insurance is now through a different route for contingency, free school meals, eligibility, maternity, and the trade union facilities time. And again, we're not proposing changing those allocation, the £1 per pupil or £1 per free school meal amounts from previous years. So it would just be the straight delegation on the similar basis as we've applied previously. So reasonably straightforward, I think, in terms of what's being proposed. Although I'm not sure how many of our maintained colleagues are actually at the meeting day to vote on this in terms of that. So it maybe take a view of whether we can vote on it now, or the vote needs to take place outside of this at a January meeting. But John, sorry.
I was going to sort of turn to Tamar at this particular point, because I believe, Nikki, this is all on you as the only maintained representative here. Tamar, is this appropriate to vote? I think, or can this wait until January, perhaps when Sasha and Guy are with us? Any thoughts, Tamar?
Sorry, I hadn't unmuted myself. Yes, I think we'll need to leave the voting until January with only one.
Okay. So and I think what we'll do is, obviously, if anybody's got any comments at this particular point, although this is mainly for maintained representatives only, but I'll take any comments that people might have. But as you say, the vote probably has to wait until January. And we might just need to think through Tamar in the future if we're, because we've only got 3 representatives. We are dependent upon those 3 turning up. So we might need to think about what are the mechanism we have to use if, for example, we're not effectively quorate in that particular type of vote.
Yeah.
Okay, again, if I take Nikki first of all, then perhaps John. Nikki?
It's just a question, really. I know we've raised this before through CPH. Is it possible to have a breakdown of what those services are? Because I think for a lot of maintained heads, it's tricky to vote on something if you're not exactly sure on how much is being given to what and what service is being provided. It would be really helpful if we could have that ahead of any voting.
Yeah, we're happy to pull that together. We have shared that previously, so and nothing's changed. We're still funding the same services. So yeah, we'll let you have a copy of that. John, can I just comment on the trade union facilities time? I just think it's probably useful we bring this one back. And obviously, we're talking maintained here. Obviously, academies buy into our local trade union facilities time. I met with one of the unions today. Obviously, some challenge there around costs. Increases. We haven't uplifted any of the charges. We're not proposing any changes there, and I think it's probably, unfortunately, the time we probably need to sit down and review that as a group. It's often held as a local authority arrangement. It's actually for everyone, and then we work collectively on it. So can I suggest that we bring this back at probably, not in the next meeting, but in the next calendar year for School Forum to have a view on that arrangement? How does it work? How is the resource allocated? What's the expectations of the group? Because I'm conscious it kind of happens not out of other forums, and I'd like a place to be able to bring it for discussion. And we think it's a positive thing. It does do positive things for the county, but I think some transparency is probably needed to support this sort of decision making, and obviously the academy's buying decisions later on.
Thank you, John. I think that's a wise suggestion as well. So thank you very much. Definitely. Okay, in which case then, as we won't be taking a vote on that at this particular meeting, again, thank you for your work on that. We'll move on to the next part of the presentation, which is growth funding and new schools. So again, not sure who's leading on this one, Martin or John.
Yeah, no, I'll pick up this to start off with, and John might have some comments. So I think first off, just to say we circulated the Appendix 4, which showed a bit of a comparison at high level between the October 21 census and the October 22 census data, and also the latest 23-24 demographers forecasts, and it kind of shows the differences at individual school level for reception to year 11. I think what's obviously apparent, and I know John's kind of picked up on this previously as well, is actually we are seeing the significant bulge in numbers coming through into the secondary phase now, as numbers are coming through, and the growth in primary sector is slowing and is actually forecast to reduce in future years based on the demographers forecast. So it'll be interesting to see if that does actually happen. And then at individual school level, and I know individual schools will be fully aware of this, I think the differences in numbers between last October census and this October census for some schools are quite stark in terms of some of the reductions, again, primarily in the primary phase, and obviously that will have a significant impact on their final funding levels for 23-24, as John alluded to earlier. But equally in some of our secondary colleagues, you're seeing some quite significant numbers in terms of growth in terms of those numbers. So again, it will be interesting to see how that then translates into the final funding formula figures for those individual schools, alongside the changes in cohorts around free school meals and all of the other funding factors. So I think what I'm saying is that the illustrative figures that we've shared previously, the changes in these pupil numbers obviously can have quite a considerable impact at individual school level when we get that final data from the DFE, hopefully in the next week or so. Also to say that the intention is to use that data, the forecast data, and work alongside our place planning colleagues as a kind of an indication as to where that growth is going to be required for the growth funding going forward. So place planning colleagues are already kind of working their way through more detailed versions of this spreadsheet, which looks at individual year groups and looking at where we think that growth is actually going to be required from next September, and whether that growth is actually going to be basic need, because I think, as we've said previously, the growth fund is only allowed to fund basic need, not parental preference. But we do recognise that actually, especially again in the secondary phase, that's sometimes harder to unpick as to what is actually driving that change and increase in numbers year on year in terms of that. So we've also attached the Appendix 5, which is the proposed growth fund policy, and in terms of that, that's kind of draft at the moment. And again, as I say, that's the intention of that is to look at a more formulaic approach as a starting point, alongside that intelligence from place planning about where that growth is actually needed, to try and avoid some of the bureaucracy we spoke about last time in terms of the application process. I think the intention would still be to, when we've got the kind of the list of schools that we're proposing growth funding will be allocated to, would be to share that with wider schools forum, and also with the kind of the head teacher panel that we've convened previously for kind of final sign off before any allocations are given out to schools. And the intention would still be to fund at a lump sum amount, as we have done in previous years. But we have, recognising the cost pressures that schools are facing, we have proposed that we're going to uplift that by 5%, based on the kind of increases in costs that we see. And so the proposed lump sums to be applied for 23-24 are shown there, and the staffing element of that, as I say, has been uplifted by 5%. We're not proposing changing the growth fund kind of pot at the moment. As well as funding this growth, it also funds the diseconomies funding for new schools which are growing to capacity, because that kind of reduces over time. That's effectively released some more money back into the growth fund. So the hope is that it will be able to cover the 5% increase that we've applied here, to cover the increases in growth that we're potentially seeing for next year as well. Although looking at the numbers, especially in the secondary phase, it could be quite costly if in terms of the amounts of additional classes that might be required to support that growth going forward. Just finally on this, shared this spreadsheet or this table with you last time around the proposed variation to pupil numbers to be applied. So again, this is for new schools in their initial years of opening, rather than them being funded on their actual October census data. They're funded on estimated data through what the DfE called variations to pupil numbers. The proposed amounts that we're proposed pupil numbers that we're going to apply are shown in the table here. Those highlighted in yellow are where we've had subsequent discussions with the individual schools and have changed those numbers to reflect the latest estimates in terms of the pupil numbers for September or for April for some of the maintained schools. Still to be confirmed, but essentially these will be the numbers that we'll be using in the next phase of the modelling, when we get the data from the DfE going forward. So happy to take any comments or observations, and in this one we would like Schools Forum to approve the proposed changes to the growth fund policy, but just to remember that it only applies for the next financial year, because obviously it has to be approved on an annual basis as per the DfE regulations.
Thank you very much, Martin. So does anybody have any comments before we move to obviously approving the proposed change to the growth funding policy? Anybody have any particular views, comments they want to raise, questions? John, do you want to go first, and then I'll go to Richard?
I was only going to make a more general comment. Obviously, we're a growing county. We are going to need more schools. We've shared with various groups and bodies the requirement for those new schools over the next 10 years. One of the challenges we're going to face, and we've been dealing with this recently around the new Alconbury Secondary School that's being established, is that we are going to see more secondary schools come through, and the timing of the opening, the viability of those with numbers is going to be a challenge for us, because you've got to remember, under the current methodology, every time we open a new school up, that there is an amount of money that will be required from all schools to contribute its setup and establishment. So one of the things I want to bring back to a future meeting is a paper trying to lay out the future, trying to work out when we're likely to see those growth in numbers, try and align where we are, try and understand the financial impact that's going to have on us. It may be something then we take up with the DfE about, actually, we're a growing county and it's not fair because of our growth that we're dealing with this, but also to give some transparency and an upfront view around the risks and challenges of opening schools. You know, we get funding from different sources. Sometimes schools need to open because a Section 106 agreement or more generally a developer agreement outlines that. And there's a risk of not doing this if we can't fund the growth, and it's your choice on the growth fund, not the local authorities. We propose you decide on this particular factor. I think we need to start looking beyond the current horizon of 1 year, which Martin's right, we can only make a decision on 1 year, but we will not need to start build that into our more strategic financial planning. So I'm going to propose we bring a paper back on that in the new year.
Thank you very much, John. Richard?
Yeah, totally agree, and would support taking a longer term view on some of these strategic decisions around growth funding. My simple point around the policy, the revised policy, section 3.2 on the 7th point, it talks about schools being notified in May of these decisions and these allocations. Whilst I can understand that might be a confirmation in May, I think it probably needs working in a little bit more explicitly the points at which schools would be informed that they have been identified formally as likely to be in receipt of growth funds, because obviously May is too late to recruit for the September. So that would be very late if that were the first that schools heard of that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Richard. I think that's right. I think speaking to place planning colleagues, I think what our intention would be to almost alongside when we publish the kind of the draft budgets or final budgets for maintained schools, is that we also publish something, so it'd be kind of early February time, would be something alongside that as well, just to give an indication of those schools where they have been identified from our list of schools who'll be qualifying, and then because those conversations have got to be happening with place planning colleagues anyway around that. So hopefully we can build something in earlier in the process around that.
I think it would be good if something in that policy indicated that there was a point built in at which schools would be notified.
Yeah, so if I build something in to say that the intention is to circulate something alongside the initial budgets to indicate that, and then that gives us a way in. So I'll add something in if that's okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for that point, Richard. Very valuable indeed. So any further comments? I'm just going to quickly look through the various members of forum. I can't see any other further hands up at this particular point. So obviously noting the proposed variations to pupil numbers, but actually what we need to do now is to approve the proposed changes to the growth funding policy, given that also what Martin said there about that amendment to be inserted in there in terms of actually when schools would be kind of informed, etc., and discussions with place planning colleagues. And obviously to remind that this policy, this criteria only applies to 23-24 only. So unless there are any further comments, and just one last check through, what I'm going to do is take a roll call of the people who can vote. I might have to just read out one or two names here, Tamar, because I can't see everybody on the screen, and whether some people have actually joined in the last few minutes.
That's fine.
If you could indicate when I call your name, please, whether you agree or disagree or wish to abstain. So first of all, Simon Bainbridge.
Yes, agreed.
Adrian Ball.
Yeah, agree.
Christopher Bennett.
Agreed.
Nikki Brown.
Agreed.
Joe Gilman.
Agreed.
Joanne Hardwick.
Agree.
Don't think I can see Sasha, so I assume she hasn't turned up. Ryan Kelsall.
Agreed.
John King.
Agreed.
Duncan Ramsey.
Agreed.
Richard Spencer.
Agree.
Paul Stratford. Paul.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Agreed. Sorry.
Karen Taylor.
Agreed.
and myself agree. Tamar, can you just confirm the results of that vote?
That's unanimous.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any further steps from that, John or Martin, apart from that amendment we need to make?
I'll make that amendment, and then I'll recirculate round, give to Tamar to recirculate out a revised version, so you can all see that.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we've covered most of this. So any other further next steps on this meeting more generally? I don't know whether it's, just reflecting back on the whole presentation, any other further comments you want to make, John or Martin?
I mean, I think yeah, sorry, John.
I think we've just got some dates. It's probably worth just reminding people of, because there's an opportunity for representation again. So Martin's going to pull these up just so people are aware of the process. So as I said, probably 21st of December, we're expecting that DSG allocation to come through. Really important that we get full attendance at the forum on 13th of January, because that will then feed into the CYP committee, who ultimately will sign off the school budget proposals as they do each year. And obviously then at that point, we'll submit our data, we'll finalise budgets as they stand, with the obviously proviso that we'll wait for ESFA to correct or change them. And just a reminder for special schools, nurseries, the early years sector more generally, that's going to be something we're going to try and do in February and March. I think we're really keen to push on and do this quickly. So we may send out some draft indicative budgets to those schools sooner rather than later, to make sure they're in a good place for their financial planning, because they've not had any information so far. So we're waiting to do that. Obviously, what we will need to talk to you about is where the additional money is going. We haven't factored in inflation anywhere at the moment in that sector, so we want to come back with some proposals. So that's going to be an important meeting in February and March to sort of work through that proposal. But Martin, I think that's probably everything we've got to share on budgets this year.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, yes, as John said, as soon as we get the DFE settlement, I'll kind of rework the figures based on the principles that we discussed at the last meeting, and obviously, hopefully, the clarity around how the additional funding is going to be allocated. Equally, the early years budgets, again, we're still waiting for that final settlement. Again, they did propose the level of uplifts on the funding for that in the July information, and we're not expecting that to change significantly. So again, that will go through to committee in January for final approval. The main thing we're probably waiting, I think, in terms of special school budgets, is the minimum funding guarantee, and as John said, how the expectation of that additional funding is going to be passported onto that sector. There's not been any more guidance on that at all at the moment, so we're a little bit on the dark on that. So that will undoubtedly require further discussion on that particular area. So I say my hope is that I will be able to circulate something out to schools first week of January, depending on when we get the settlement, in terms of those illustrative figures or revised figures. In most years, touch wood, they don't tend to change that much after that point, and unless there's any significant issues which are flagged up by the ESFA. So just to say, for that meeting on the 13th of January, we'll provide whatever information we can, but some of the figures might be tabled right up until the point because of the timescales of producing those at this time of year.
Thank you very much, Martin. Does anybody have any further comments on those next steps as outlined by John and Martin? Okay, thank you very much. And Tamar, probably just a note, I mean, obviously all meetings of Schools Forum, we would sort of say it's very important we have full attendance, but obviously that one, again, as John was stressing, in order that we can actually sort of clearly send an endorsement for the proposals to Children and Young People's Committee, I think it's important that we do everybody there. And if people can't be there, then they can nominate a substitute in those circumstances as well. So I think we just need to stress that probably, especially at the start of term when people are busy doing lots of other things. And of course, there will be Ofsted inspections and so on, but we obviously do want full attendance there. Okay, in which case then moving on to the final item on the agenda, which is any other business. Does anybody have any other business they want to raise? We do have obviously the kind of forward planning for the agenda, which Tamar did send around, I think, a couple of weeks ago. And we've actually added some additional points on that agenda plan. One is to discuss the safety valve update at the next meeting on the 13th of January. Another reason why it's actually critical that everybody's there, because obviously that's a major piece of work that the local authority has been engaged in with the department. And sort of growth funding further update, I think, obviously in March and going beyond that as well, as John indicated earlier on. So we have some pretty chunky items ahead of us. Anybody want to raise any other further points though at the end of this meeting? Okay, in which case I can't see any hands going up. It just leaves me to say, obviously, a huge thank you to everybody for your participation, either as new members this term, or if you've been a more long-standing member of Forum, for your contribution over the course of this calendar year. My thanks also to local authority officers, in particular, obviously John and Martin, and also to Tamar and Rhiannon as well as Democratic Services officers for their brilliant support of Schools Forum. In which case, only probably just leaves me to say, I hope that whatever remaining days of the term you have left are fairly quiet ones. Hopefully you're beyond any further Ofsted inspections now. But when Christmas does come, obviously take the time to relax, and I wish you all the best. That concludes the business meeting. And thank you very much for your attendance, and for the people watching, I now declare the meeting closed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.